Okay, hello. Hello all, good afternoon. Welcome to this beautiful rainy evening. That probably it's gonna get very, very nice because today we have the pleasure to have with us Bernard Khoury. Bernard Khoury is, as you know, a Lebanese architect. I met him a couple of months ago when I was in Beirut. I went to his office that he is running into an industrial area of Beirut. It's a very similar factory to ours. He doesn't have the laboratory though, but he has a laboratory of ideas. And I was pretty amazed by the way that he has been dealing not only with the way that he has been working, but also with the thinking and the brainstorming behind all the work and the proposals that he's doing in architecture. I consider that he is one of the big bang architects. I name big bang architects the ones that they are able to think out of the box, but at the same time they are able to apply those ideas in real scenarios and real scale. So I'm a big fan of his first two build projects. The one is the BO18 Club that I had the pleasure to visit, by the way, when I was in Beirut. This idea of how to combine new programmatic uses into problematic areas that some people has the fear to come close to, I think it's part of the way that he thinks. I think it's part of what it makes him a local hero, not only in his territory, but also outside Lebanon. And I'm very, very glad that part of his work is also related with how to understand architecture as a performance. So buildings that they can open and close through pneumatic systems, or residents that they can go up into their towers and park their cars into their living rooms. And again, thinking out of the box and understanding how the current technologies of production and the power of design can change the way that we inhabit our buildings today. So Bernard, it's a big pleasure to have you here today. And please help me welcome him.
I'm very happy to be here. I haven't seen anything like that before, like this place. So this is fantastic. And my first impression is a kind of an underground laboratory that fights the fascism and the hegemony of the building industry, beating them on their own territory. So using advanced technologies to escape the very limited territory of the construction industry is a very noble cause. I very much encourage you for doing that, and I'm very happy to be here. But I will start this talk tonight with a few stories about characters that were very important that I met through my path, through my practice over the last 15, 20 years. So I'll not be talking strictly about architecture, at least in the beginning. In order of appearance is what you see at the end of movies. It's about the cast, the characters that appear in the story. It's also the last chapter of a book I published about a year ago that's entitled Local Heroes. So I will start with the entertainer. The entertainer, who was a very key character in my story. My story with the entertainer goes back to I'd say the mid-80s. This man, obviously, I did not meet in the campus of Harvard University. This guy is a high school dropout. Worked as started his professional career as a professional drummer in the various clubs and bars of West Beirut during the war years. And then at some point in the mid-late 80s, started organizing what he called musical therapy sessions in his small studios. And I was very fortunate to attend or be there at the very beginning of those musical therapy sessions. Now, the musical therapy sessions are evenings or parties that start quite late in the evening and end up very early or at late hours or very early in the morning, where we were not allowed to speak. We just listened to music. We ended up most of the time lying down horizontally on the floor, abused of alcohol and other various substances. So the little I know about music is from this man. And by the early 90s, when I started heading back towards Beirut, the entertainer was still organizing some of these parties. And at some point, he met a special lady, and this special lady had the means to take the musical therapy sessions, take them public, meaning opening literally a bar, a club that would take this thing public. And they did that at some point, I think in 93, 94. And they literally changed the face of Beirut. They did it without me, their first take. They changed the face of Beirut in a very drastic way. And I find this, in fact, was a political act. So it was not only that, the kind of images that Beirut exported in its early so-called post-war years. So reconstruction here is not limited to buildings, but to other things too. And on my way to Beirut in the early 90s, I was naively expecting a great reconstruction project that obviously never came around. Went through 16 commissions, contractual engagements with clients that never materialized in any sort of construction. So in order to forget, I spent a lot of nights in various clubs and bars. This is me. I had long hair. This is not me. This is me. But at some point, running a club and being married is not an obvious thing to do. So things went sour with his special lady, and one day he decided to leave her and leave the club, and came to me. And the only thing he had kept with him was about 3,000 vinyls, music. That's all he had. And we decided to build a club together. That was at that point back in 97. And in order to build a club with very little means, obviously we could not purchase a land. We had to place it strategically somewhere in the city, somewhere we could afford. So we started looking at an area called the quarantine of the port of Beirut, which is a doomed area, strangely very close to the center, but still very undeveloped. The quarantine had a very sour past. So to look for a site in the quarantine, I was told I should go talk to the broker of the church, because the church in Lebanon is the biggest landowner, which we did. And pretty soon, I meet the broker, was the second character. The broker had a very complicated past, and I realized this very early on in the process. Because as I told him that I was looking for a site in the quarantine, he told me, I know the quarantine like the palm of my hand. I cleaned it up in 1976. In 1976, up until that point, there was an important Palestinian refugee camp in the quarantine, and it was wiped out in the early weeks of 1976, end of January, early February. It was burned down to the ground. We never delved back into these stories, but it was quite a sad and horrific picture. And the man responsible for that cleaning of the camp was the broker. The broker I had met, with whom I was looking for a site. So you can imagine already the kind of introduction I had to the first site I ended up building. The broker leads me to the landowner, because pretty soon we realized the church didn't have a proper land for us. So we ended up with the landowner, who also had quite a problematic past. The landowner was the nephew of the general of the so-called Southern Lebanese army, who had collaborated with the Israeli army in the so-called security zone up until the year 2000. And this young, street-smart guy had built ties both in and out of Israel. And by the early 90s, the Lebanese militias were forced to dissolve and basically turn back their weapons, give back their weapons, which the Christian militias, the Lebanese forces, did. But in the meantime, they sold most of their artilleries to the Balkans, which were igniting their own war. The landowner turns out to be a key person in this story, because he was a broker of a major arms deal, and one of the last biggest arms deal that happened with the Balkans. He was the middleman, and it is said that we're talking about deals here in the tens, not to say maybe in the hundreds of millions of dollars, maybe even more. And at some point, he refused to relay the money. When the leader of the Lebanese forces was put in jail, he kept the money and stayed in Brazil. So this is the second key character I meet while approaching my site in the quarantine. My site in the quarantine is this thing you see here. There's something odd about this picture, although it's pretty old, but Beirut is a Mediterranean city, and as you know, Mediterranean cities start their growth on the coast, and then they go inland. The coast is up this way, and what's very strange about the quarantine, although it's located at the northeastern tip of Beirut, what you see beyond this highway, which is where the wall of the camp was raised. So behind this wall were the camps, the refugee camps that were burned down to the ground in '76. And this way is inland. Now, inland is a very dense fabric, yet the coastal part is still very scarce. So you can see literally from an aerial photograph that there's a very visible scar of the past conflicts, even 20 or so years later, even up to this point, over 30 years later. The quarantine hasn't scarred yet. So what do you do when you're asked to design a place of debauchery, of partying, whatever you want to call it, on a site that has such a problematic past? You don't design a building, which is exactly what we've done. Our building is, in fact, 70 centimeters high from the ground. So when you drive on the highway during the day, you don't see it. And what it does is that it preserves the void. It is an invisible building that is asleep during the day. You don't see it. And it wakes up at night. Wakes up at night, and it opens up to the sky by means of receding its panels, and one big major fan panel that flips up open like a lid. And that panel not only reflects the lights and the warmth of the life below, but also reflects the sound, because nobody lives in the quarantine. This is one of the reasons why we were there, not only because it was cheap to rent a piece of land there, but because we could make a lot of noise. We didn't have to worry about the entourage. So the VO18 produces a lot of noise. Turns out a few years later, I rented an office in an industrial building just a couple of 100 meters away from it. And it's interesting because there's no life in this area. And at 3, 4 in the morning, when we're doing all-nighters, sometimes we hear boom, 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 the bass of the club, which brings life to this area. And I think it's the most flattering thing for me, because we've brought some life to the area. But something that might interest you more that has to do with the construction industry. You have to understand, I went out of school I graduated from very respectable schools from which I did not learn much. And I never went and worked for anyone. I was fortunate not to work in any architecture office and never really learned the trades. So by the time I designed the first building I actually built, I designed it completely wrong relative to the construction industry. So when I put my drawings to contractors, because I had contacts locally with known contractors, they all looked at me like it was time to go back to school or to learn a bit more about the trades of the industry, because everything about my design was wrong. So the contractors didn't want to build this thing. So I turned around and worked with a truck manufacturer, a guy who built garbage trucks, you know, with hydraulics that compact the garbage. And when he looked at my drawings, it was a piece of cake for him. And we ended up building this roof, which cost us at the time $57,000, which was probably less than if you had to clad a basic hangar with cladding materials imported from China. So although everything was wrong about this building in terms of the construction industry, it's interesting because this building was designed to last only 5 years, the period of which we had the initial lease of the piece of land, after which we were supposed to leave and the building was supposed to be bulldozed. This was back in 1997, 1998. So I designed and I built something with steel plates out of the mill, black because it comes out of the mill, black, but I never painted it, never protected it, because I thought that 6mm steel would take a lot of time to rust, certainly more than the 5 years that would be there. So this roof that opens and closes many times every night, and has been doing that for over 20 years because the club has survived way over its initial lease, never leaked a single drop of water on its roof. The contractors were wrong. In fact, we had water leakages, but underground in the waterproofing membrane, which was standard stock out of the building industry. The waterproofing membrane behind the concrete wall under the ground, that leaked. So much for the contractors and the construction industry. So this is a club below when it was fresh and new. And these are more recent photos. You can understand now how this thing closes, and it's still kicking and alive some 20 years later. It's almost 20 years old. I don't know if many clubs have survived so long. And it's amazing what sometimes cheap materials can do for you. The underface of the lid that opens is made of very cheap plexiglass sheets that end up wrapping as the steel contracts and retracts. So it gives you very interesting, very liquidish reflections of the background. And at night, you can see the cars running on the highway flickering on these mirrors. It has a very disco effect. And this is the club again at early hours in the morning. At that point, this guy's passed out. This woman doesn't know what she's doing. This woman also doesn't know what she's doing, and the bouncer doesn't really care. This is a building I designed down to the last bolt, and I modeled with very primitive modeling softwares at the time. And I would draw at night for myself, and go to the site in the morning and open the site because no one could read the drawings on the site. They were drawings for myself. So everything that is built in 3 dimensions, in fact, down to the bolt, correct on my very primitive CAD model. This is a more recent picture of it. Now it's completely rusted, and it has stains of rust on the concrete plate around it. This is me. Sometimes I like posing in front of my buildings. A very important central character also is the Prime Minister, who is a key in the so-called reconstruction project, or the so-called post-war period, who led successive governments in the early 90s up until he was assassinated in 2005. The Prime Minister was a tycoon, an entrepreneur, and a contractor who had built his fortune in Saudi Arabia and became very close to the king, and became later on their man in the region, and represented at some point in time sort of a very liberal capitalist Islam, which the West was very interested in, and became a very, very powerful figure, I think, beyond just our local politics. This man was the man behind a reconstruction project that never really led to its fruition, but the only post-war reconstruction project, and I mean by reconstruction, not only building, but literally sort of a national project he had for our territory, where he thought that Beirut could become again the very central hub of finance in the region. This is what Beirut looked like in the early 90s, or the former city center, the central district, that had become a no man's land or battlefield for over 15 years. So we're talking 1975, 1990. The whole sector of the city was not, could not be penetrated. It was just the battlefield of the various fractions throughout that period. And at that point, the prime minister comes in with a great reconstruction project and privatizes the whole area because the state was bankrupt, the state was corrupt, the state was incompetent, the state didn't have the means to rebuild this very symbolic project. So he took it over. But it's interesting because you have a prime minister who's at the same time an entrepreneur who also is the main architect or the man behind the private company that in fact took in charge the reconstruction of that whole sector. And to me, this was very symptomatic and very symbolic of the so-called post-war years. So there was a reconstruction project in the works, but it was not a reconstruction project as you understand it in the West. Beirut was never rebuilt in the conventional sense of the term, as in fact the nation was never rebuilt because the national institutions were never rebuilt and the nation state was never rebuilt. So it was time for the private sector to take over not 90%, not 99% of the territory, but 100% of the territory. So how do you act as an architect who was fed in the great academic cocoons that I spent too much time in, that fed you the idea that you're only a good architect if you build a public building or a noble building. A noble public building would be a museum, a memorial, an opera house, public housing, a school. But none of that came around because the institutions never came around. The institutions were never rebuilt. The state was never rebuilt. And I'm left with a private sector. And I started my career in the entertainment industry. But prior to that, as I was still in my academic cocoon, I spent some time with the late Lebbeus Woods, a man I adored, who was secretly working on Zagreb, who was fascinated by this idea of war and architecture, and has kind of forced me to work on Beirut. I had never approached Beirut until that time. We're back in 1991, so this was 25 years ago. I was young and full of hope and good morals. Very aware at that point of the power, the seductive power that war demolition had on me and potentially on all of us. The fetishization of the ruin was something I was already very much aware of, the danger of that. But I went ahead and literally faced that by building quite a big scale concrete building that had absolutely no architectural features or interesting features, because this was not about architecture. And the idea was to turn these war-torn cadavers, their demolition, into an architectural act. And by doing that, trying to scar the city. The project is called Evolving Scars. And in Evolving Scars, there was a very naive attempt to try to build a collective memory. So I was still at the time where I thought, in my academic cocoon, that we can formulate a common history. And this would be the beginning of the scarring of the city and the beginning of the recovery of a so-called potential post-war period. And I did that by introducing what I call the memory collector, sealing the ruin into a sort of a double transparent membrane. And the idea is that there would be a parallel or an association between the amount of memory that is collected and the amount of matter that is being demolished. So the more memory we collect, the more matter we demolish, and we would spread the ashes of the building in the double-sided membrane around its periphery. And we could quantify the amount of memory that we would be collecting in kilobytes and megabytes, and we would know the amount of matter we would need to demolish in cubic meters. So there was already an attempt to bring in this idea of immaterial memory and how it manifests itself in the disappearance of the physical memory. The disappearance of the physical memory giving way for another memory, which has the image of its time, an immaterial memory. So you see the good memory collector here in action, reaching almost its point of saturation. The membrane is almost saturated when the memory collector has reached almost its saturation point also. And at that point, the memory collector would dig its hole into the ground and the whole structure would collapse. And the last archaeological layer, because Beirut has 6 archaeological layers, the last archaeological layer of Beirut would be immaterial at the image of its time, and we would have erased the physical memory of the buildings that were gone. Looking back at this, I find it extremely politically naive, as I was very removed and far from the sour political realities of the no reconstruction project that would never come around. But what I'm interested in, and what follows me to this date, is this idea of, and I don't know of any project at this point that makes out of the disappearance of matter an architectural exercise. Now, bringing you back to the basics, us architects erect matter. This is what we do. We're the last practice that is still imprisoned in the Stone Age. As much as you want to go digital, as much as you want to engage with new technologies, at the end of the day, you're still, at the end of the day, crystallize your ideas in matter. Unlike many other mediums today that produce meaning, architecture at this point, at its best, unfortunately, represents meaning by means of architectural representation, by producing odd forms and odd shapes. But very rarely do we really engage in new technologies in the sense that they allow us to go beyond the conventional territory of architecture, which remains very much entrapped in physical matter, therefore in the Stone Age. We are the last survivors of the Stone Age. As much as some of us have pretended over the last 30 or 40 years to juggle with this idea of immateriality, we've been complete idiots and morons on that front. All what we've produced is transvestites of that, extremely superficial transvestites with very odd forms that are in fact completely trapped in matter. Remember that. So back to Beirut and my very humble beginnings in the entertainment industry. No museums, no public housing, no hospitals, no noble projects, but more entertainment projects. This is where I started, at the very bottom, in projects that were not initially politically accountable for. Because when you build a nightclub, and when these projects, or a bar or restaurant, usually these projects are given basements in buildings. They're not even given an architecture to represent whatever they stand for. But here, strangely, I'm given the chance to design and erect buildings for these futile programs. My second project is located in a structure that was supposedly under historical protection. It's very interesting to see what historical protection means for the so-called historians. You keep the facade of the building and its footprint. You stretch the skin of the mummy and you make it look like it supposedly looked at some point in time. You reproduce a transvestite kind of a postcard of some kind of very dangerously romantic picture of what once was there, supposedly. And that is memory. Whatever you do inside is not important. I must say I owe this project to my structural engineer, because all what the supposedly historical commission was concerned with was the skin of the building. They didn't care about us putting another animal inside that had nothing to do with the skin. So my structural engineer starts drawing very technical but very spontaneous drawings of how you keep the skin of the building up while you're gutting it out and taking the content out to plant another monster inside. You put these temporary plates, you connect temporary beams that are connected by temporary beams inside, and then you erect your new monster inside, and by the time you're done with that, you've disconnected the old floor slabs from the initial load-bearing walls of the periphery. You gut them out, and then as you've built your new structure, and then you replaster this old stone facade, which was very porous, and you paint it in some kind of pastel color to make it look really cute and historical. And I said, no. We keep the temporary beams. We assume the crime that you're committing, that is history. And I really owe this project to my structural engineer, and also to the bar we've planted above to replace the skin. This is another act of resistance against the construction industry. Everything here was built locally by local artisans, down to the profiles of the windows. We did not buy anything from the industry, not an ashtray, not a chair, not a table. Everything was built in situ. This is an act of political resistance against the crap that gets imported from China and the standards that are fed to us by the Anglo-Saxon culture. Important to note that in the middle of that plan was one single table around which about 50 people could be seated. And if you follow my cursor here, there's an H circuit which serves for the service. The waiters are trapped inside the table. They are prisoners of the table. They cannot escape the table. their only escape from the table is this staircase that takes them down to their hole where they belong, the kitchen downstairs. So they don't share the space you're seated in. They're prisoners inside the table. If you look at the section, you will see that the plane on which the waiters are walking is 40 centimeters lower than the plane you're seated on, so that you always look at them from above, and they always look at you from below. There's this sense of absurd social situation here, social setup, and this is the staircase that leads them down to the hall where they belong. And the space becomes an extremely pretentious space, way beyond the restaurant. It's no longer a restaurant. We've designed everything here down to the high back chairs that were extremely heavy to maneuver, and they look like electric chairs. And above is this, in a sort of very divine position was the bar, because the bar is a very divine space for me. This is it under construction. And this is what I meant by not replastering the facade, but keeping the traces of our crime and accentuating it by adding a secondary structure with wire mesh. And I call this the poetry of decay. So we let the building rot more and more behind. And everything we've added here is very much assumed in a sort of a very brutal manner. This is the bar upstairs, which opens up almost like another lid that opens, but like the thing you put the bread in, you know, in a circular motion. This is the bar closed, and this is it open. This one also never leaked, but there was no building contractor involved in it. And this is the absurd table downstairs. It's interesting because there were people who really loved this setup, but they would go there and they wouldn't talk to each other, and they wouldn't eat, if anything. It was just a situation you would be living in an hour or two. People would stare at each other, but they wouldn't talk to each other. These are not microphones. They're pilot lamps that light up your plate, that suddenly becomes a reflector, and your face is lit from your plate below. This is not just about eating. And after that, I'm trapped into this entertainment industry that, because these places were very successful, I'm commissioned by a visionary client, I must say, to build on another problematic site on the demarcation line. This is West Beirut, this is East Beirut. This is a time in 2000 where this neighborhood had not been rehabilitated yet. So the building next door was still squatted by refugees living off $150 a month, mainly construction workers, without handrails, without running water, without window profiles. And here we are erecting a monument for a sushi bar right next door that will offer sushi at $100 a pop, which is probably close to the salary of the guy next door. Any architect with a minimum of moral would have turned his back to this kind of commission and run away. But I did not, because these are the sour realities of my city. And what you see here is the situation back then. This is our building standing majestically in a completely absurd manner, and this was what this project was about. It was the impossibility of implementing this program on this specific site at this specific moment in time. And it's exactly what we did. Mainly, the restaurant is not here. The restaurant is not what you see. The restaurant is below. What you see here is an absurdly celebrated reception tower that's 7 meters high, that puts you in a vitrine in the middle of a circular room that sucks you down below. Above is just the mechanical stuff, which you usually don't look at. And when you arrive below, smack in the center of the bar, and everything is articulated around this absurd circular room that travels ups and down, ups and down, from the street level down to the bar level below, with absurdly sized big couches and an oval table, and then you land in the middle of the bar, and everything is organized around this. So again, in this project, we had the luxury of designing everything down to the lights, the ashtrays. Nothing was bought from the industry. We were in complete control of building the instruments that were the result of this situation we had constructed. So you can enjoy your meal at $100 a pop, in complete denial of what is happening literally behind the wall, while your only connection to the outside world is the sky and nothing but the sky. We're very religious in Beirut, so it saves you from your denial. God can do great things for you. And after this third project for the entertainment sector, I realized it was about time to stop, because I had said what I had to say, and I was banned from other sectors of the industry. No developer thought that they could build and promote a building that I had designed for families that could live in there and grow their kids in, because I was associated to places of debauchery again. And the critic would say, this guy is not an architect. He just builds dramatic situations, but he cannot build it. He cannot build spaces that on a daily basis. I think they were wrong, but let me take you through the first exercise, and it was a major leap and a major break in my career, going from complete control of my temporary projects. Again, the first 6 projects I built were temporary projects that had an expiry date that was set prior to me designing them. It's a very odd thing for an architect, because we are, again, trapped in the Stone Age. We live in permanence. We have no sense of temporality. We're this last practice which is completely stuck in the Stone Age and in impermanence. But there was one courageous developer who comes to me and tells me, we're gonna design a shell and core development for the upper segment of the industry. Shell and core, I will translate what this means in their jargon. Shell and core means the architect is responsible to develop the shell of the building, meaning its facades, and the core, the common circulation area. And then you have to disappear as much as possible from the inhabitable floor plates, because people who buy into these buildings are too sophisticated for us architects. They come in with their own interior architects who are smarter than us, much behaved and much better than us, and much more adequate to do the job. So the idea here is to completely disappear. I come from temporary buildings where I had complete control down to the ashtray, but nothing from the industry, to a contractor who tells me, now you're moving to permanence, but you have to disappear. I just give you the facade and the common areas, but the main issue here, which is the livable space, you have to be as transparent and as non-existent as possible. It's interesting because I always go by neighborhoods. It's right behind the Centrale. So I decided to, almost in a masochistic way, to take what was inflicted upon me and try to make an exercise out of it. So if I'm not supposed to leave any traces of my existence or my passage on this building, let me see to what extent I can do this. Voluntarily disappear, in almost a masochistic way. And first thing I realized, well, I don't want to design this building, so I don't want to design its morphology. I took the building law and applied the zoning law and the setback law on that specific site, exactly down to the last cubic centimeter. So the envelope is designed by the setback, a literal interpretation of it. I did not design the shape of this building. You can see it in section. I didn't do it. Okay? Then they don't want me in the plan. I will completely disappear. Let's see where this takes us. So I take the shell and core literally, and I transpose it to the structure, meaning the shell and the core will be load bearing. There will be almost no columns inside, so that this refined and more intelligent architects later on could do whatever they want inside with absolutely no trace of my passage, not even structure. So the shell and the core is what holds the building up. And on the long blind walls, there are continuous shafts on which you can plug bathrooms and kitchens. Therefore, I did not design the plans either. So I did not design the morphology of the building, not its shape, not its plans. And then pretty soon, it was a very successful operation. Pretty soon, I have 7 different architects calling me, Mr. Khoury, we want the facades. And I refused to give them facades. I told them to do their job, do their own plans, interior elevations, give them to me. I will project them to the outside. And this is why the windows are not aligned. It's not because I was trying to be funky or any kind of funny stuff that stupid architects do by making stupid shifts and twists. No, it happened very organically. So I recap. My first permanent building, I come from complete control in the temporary buildings to no control voluntarily. And the 3 prerogatives of the architects, which are designing the morphology of the building, drawing a plan, and doing the elevations, I did not do. Yet this is architecture. So much for the conventional territory of architecture that you guys draw. This is a building I did not draw. Now, to a more humble cause here, because I contradict myself again from one street corner to the other. I have no problem with that. I like to talk about concepts and not recognizable syntax. This is a building that probably represents best my fight against the developer's formula. Those who did not want me to build for families. Those who were building over the last 40 years, literally 100% of everything that was built in Beirut over the last 40 years were very bad recuperations of the modern recipes, and I mean really bad, with a hint of an Anglo-Saxon flair to them. That means a central core smack in the middle of the plan, which means that you get out of your elevator at noon on the 15th of August, you have to turn on the light to put your key into your door. Those are criminals, and I'm out to kill them. So, and they give you deep plans with low ceilings. The family's in the back, the reception's in the front, and you're allowed for an extra 20% of balconies that they spread around, and they end up glazing. So sometimes between your door and the tip of the slab, there's 15 to 20 meters with 3 meters of ceiling height, blind corridors that connect these segregated areas, and you live in a box, as if the outside was hostile territory. This building represents a very frontal fight against these typologies. And the story is very simple. You wake up in the morning, you get out on your balcony, you go down the stairs, you turn around the olive tree, grab a coffee in the kitchen, take the newspaper in the living room, and go down and see your kids without ever walking inside. There's a forced carnal relationship with the city that sort of reconciles you back to the city, and in fact brings back a very Mediterranean behavior, and produces what I call a good urban fabric, a good social fabric, one that reconnects you to your neighbor, to the street, to your surroundings, and not the closed-in boxes that segregate and cuts and disconnects you from your surroundings. So I can be a good guy sometimes. And it's the only thing you see in the facade, no funny stuff. And this is me again. I like to pose on my buildings. Perhaps the closest thing I ever built for the residential sector that connects me back to my entertainment years is something we've very recently finished. And again, I owe this to the heroes I worked with. This was the young entrepreneur who comes to my office one day telling me he's purchased, or he's thinking of purchasing, a plot in an area that really would be very difficult, where it would be very difficult to build for the residential sector, particularly the market he taps into. But he had a very radical idea here, which consisted of attracting playboys, or a building that has no families, no kids, no school buses, none of the stuff that you would expect to see in a polite residential building. And the idea was to create small apartments for bachelors mainly, or divorcees, or whatever, people who don't have kids and don't bear these kinds of responsibilities. And the idea is that out of the club, mostly maybe clubs that I've built, they would drive their car back into their building and up into their apartments, which you see takes on a big part of the living space. And if they're lucky enough, they would stay with their partner in the car and not even make it to the bedroom upstairs. And we built this thing, and it's now complete. And he was right. There's not a single family in this building. No kids, no school buses, none of that. And it worked. It was quite a successful venture. Now people are building around us because this is my bike in the freight elevator that takes the car upstairs. This is me riding the bike in one of the apartments. This is a car in one apartment. I also built for the son of the president, and this is a very visible building if you ever make it to Beirut. I like it because it's an ugly building, but because it really translates the very tumultuous relationship I had with the son of the ex-president, and the various interests that are at stake here. And pretty soon, all the order of my facades and the whole logic of the morphology of my building was destroyed by clients wanting this, the market wanting that, as we were moving up, and the building changing and accommodating to that. And at the end of the day, I look at it and I love it because it's a building that comes out of bad soil and does not really care about its syntax. And it kind of fits with its surroundings. It announces the kind of catastrophe we're heading at in terms of this unregulated fabric that Beirut is. And it stands as a signal in front of the port, and it engages a very interesting dialogue with the port, I think. You see it here too. Obviously, there are always very decadent apartments on the roofs for the lucky few. This is Beirut. I like to describe Beirut as a very crowded room, extremely crowded room where people cannot move anymore. They're shoulder to shoulder but they're all solitary. They're solitary developments that go up in the complete denial of what's literally right next door to you. And this is the result of a complete political bankruptcy at the level of institutions. The end of the nation state is in this picture. It is catastrophic, nightmarish fabric, but I find it extremely complex and extremely interesting. And you have to understand what brought us to this. It all boils down to politics at the end of the day. But when you practice here, you have to understand this. You have to understand the survival mechanisms that are at hand here that you have to develop in order to survive in this catastrophe. Otherwise, get out of Beirut. You have nothing to do there. They'll kill you in a split second. So the strategies that we work on in Beirut are very, very different than the more stable environments you live in here. This is where I live, and I've decided to literally celebrate this. I live around one large window that is 6 meters by 12, and that is planted smack in the middle of all of that, with probably the highest pedestrian bridge that overlooks Beirut and overlooks my interior. I will skip a lot of the artisanry work. This was, since my entertainment years, I had never done an interior, and this project allowed me to reconnect with some of the artisans and really go at it. I will test you, those who know what this material is, the construction of this, the material used for this machine, that is my HVAC systems. I will offer you a free ticket to Beirut and a bedroom to sleep in for a week. I keep my promise. You have 3 choices. You will never guess. But this is the great thing about working with artisans. You can pervert sometimes materials in the most unexpected way. And that's my pool. I know it's not very architects usually have more sensitive ways of inscribing their houses in the city, and I think it's just a very arrogant and pompous way of sort of celebrating my presence in this catastrophic fabric around me, with 2 light poles that were inspected by the secret services of the army when we installed them, because they were worried that this was military equipment. Then one of my neighbors downstairs who wanted to sue me, telling me that in 2006 the Sahel planes had bombarded what was a water well, and that we would be next in the next war. And I told him, if I get bombarded by the Sahel planes because of these 2 cannons, I would be the victim of my architecture. It would be a great way to leave this world. This is another building that's nearing completion, probably the largest development we've tackled in Beirut locally, 400 meters of periphery. And this is, again, very symptomatic of the complete bankruptcy of the institutions. Beirut is probably the only city I know of that is evolving in the absence of any master plan. So what's interesting here is that about 400 meters of periphery, out of which only 5.5 meters meet public ground. This means that on the remaining 390 meters or so, I could have a blind wall, literally turning its back to me, 50 meters of height, smack in front of my plot limits. So what we've done, unlike any other reasonable architect who would have retracted to ensure himself enough leeway within his own site, in complete denial of the catastrophes that could happen around, I engaged with the catastrophe and aligned with the whole periphery of the site and started setting back upwards as we're going up. And this has sculpted the building in a very interesting way. It looks like a very violent building, but what it is, in fact, is the most polite and friendly gesture you can do to your potential neighbor, by leaning down and giving them enough breathing space so that they don't turn their back to you. And this has produced very interesting floor slabs for apartments. Very interesting, extremely stretched, where again, you're engaging with the outside. You're completely, the slab is so thin, there's so much terraces around that you basically don't know whether you're living inside or whether you're living outside. And the handrails are bars. They are 110 centimeters high by 50 meters deep, which is what a bar is, literally on the whole periphery of your apartment, so that you engage with your potentially with your future neighbor. I did not draw these slabs. This was literally a very mathematic offset as we're going up. The man overseas is a very interesting figure who has disappeared. Again, another guy who disappeared in Brazil. When we're doing a completely different kind of development here, by program, a completely sealed development whereby it resembles more of a fortress than anything I've showed you before. But again, in this situation, we celebrated and we take what is called the controlled room to start with, and it's usually located three floors below the ground with a guy wearing a cap, facing screens, watching over who comes in and out. And we've taken him and we've projected him 80 meters above the ground so he can fly and overlook the site. And all the other remaining shared parts of the program are very seriously celebrated on the facade. You can land back at the entrance gate of the city, of the building, where it meets the main boulevard that enters Beirut northbound. The corporate mogul to whom I had sold a great scenario over a site overlooking the Barouk Reserve, the cedars, probably the only few cedars left in Lebanon, except the one that is on our flag. The only cedars I know of Lebanon are those that I see, and I've seen since my childhood, as you exit Roissy, the airport going towards Paris. So the cedars of Lebanon for me are in Paris, they're not in Lebanon. But strangely, this guy comes, he's a very powerful man, probably one of the richest men in Kuwait, and is given the chance to visit this tip of this hill overlooking the Cedars Reserve. And we're at an altitude where at a certain point of the year, the clouds stop literally at 20 meters below you. So you have the feeling that you're floating above the clouds in the sky. And you can see the Bekaa Valley and Beirut. This is why Tzahal, the Israeli army, we've always come back to them. In 82, flattened the top of that mount to install their artillery so they could bomb, they could hit the Bekaa Valley and Beirut from there. And then they left. So we're left with this shaved top of the mount, which is national property. And this man wants to die there. He tells our main politician in charge of the region, I want it. So after negotiation, the guy says, well, you can enjoy it for a few years, but it will remain state property. He ends up in my office because he was told that he can't build a serious castle there. He has to do something extremely minimal. So 2-3 months later, I traveled to Kuwait to present my concept to my client, where I decided to give him, he wanted a covered pool, so I gave him a sphere, 17 meters of diameter in marbles, literally in the belly of the mountain where he wants to die. And nothing above that plane, which was shaved except just the roof, is built. And he looks at it and he's very furious because he sees mullions and he sees a building. While in the beginning I had sold him just a panorama, telling him this is where you eat, this is where you wake up, this is where you have sex, this is where you sleep, and so on. And there will be no building. And I tell him, but 5 meters high windows that are circular, we need mullions to open and close. And he almost kicks me out of his house, gives me a call a few weeks later as he was visiting Beirut with his 70-meter long vessel and tells me, come have a drink. I arrive, but before the drink, he takes me down to the machine room. And then he shows me 2 beautiful turbines. And he tells me that this is the only private vessel in the world that has these turbines that were developed for the military, so that for the submarines, so that they do not get detected because they do not emit any vibrations. And he's waited years to get them and paid a fortune so that he can cruise while he sleeps. And he looks at me and says, the mullions have to go. So the mullions went. And we've developed a facade that recedes down, while the columns also recede down into the ground. And it was sent to a company in Germany who evaluated just the glazing of the building to $8 million. He said, do it, but then for some political reasons, we couldn't work on that site. The banker is someone I built, I'm working on his bank right now, but I also built his house a few years ago, which allows him to sleep with his feet dangling above the stars, under the stars. So it's basically a building that has 52 engines in its roof and is another very close collaboration with great old artisans and an act of resistance against the construction industry. You see, it's quite a complex structure. It has a balcony that allows him to sit on the balcony and go down to the pool. Another very simple and humble act is at about 2,000 meters of altitude, so just to leave Beirut, a building that has an inclined facade on the main street that goes up and leads you to a pool where you can float at 2,000 meters of altitude again. It's kind of a very godly feeling that I love to give to my clients. We're not going to talk about the German developer. We're not here to talk about Germany. and not about Santa Cesarea either. We'll skip that. We'll skip Kuwait too. This was the Formula One of molds, but I will skip that. The son of the dictator. This is obviously prior to 2011. You know this man. They had over $40 billion of surplus in their national budget, and the idea was to build. There were 5 different projects that were commissioned to develop the territory. This one was supposed to be the Gate of Africa, and all they sent me for the site is a Google image photo, and they tell me it's somewhere here. We're talking 750,000 square meters of built area, and I keep asking for the site, and they keep pointing at it being somewhere here. So obviously there was no limit to the site. They could build whatever they wanted to, and what we've done is one single gesture, which is a topographic manipulation that extends over 7.5 kilometers by about 100 meters in width, that intersects with the various incidents that happen around its course. So it's not a building. Consider it like a semi-sunken one-story building up and under the ground, below and above. And the idea is that it's pointing in the north-south axis towards Europe and deep into Africa. What a literal way of saying gateway to Africa. It would make Dubai look stupid here, or the wall of China look archaic in satellite photos. And as you get close, you would see that it is the soil that is allowing the spaces to happen. But in 2011, the revolution came, and it was the end of my story. Talk about the Arab world and modernity. This is Bahrain. We see all sorts of crap freshly imported from the Anglo-Saxon industry, mainly US, Canada, South Africa, Australia. And what they give us is this kind of crap, this shit of buildings that twist. This is Kuwait, the tallest concrete structure in the world built by SOM, and it does that desperately. Concrete. Why? I don't know. Another idiot that does that next to him, and that's what we get from our American friends and Canadians and South African and English-speaking wise architect that, and we think, or Arabs think, that modernity is something you can purchase and buy. But it wasn't always like that. In the early years of the young republics, Cairo, Baghdad, Beirut, Damascus have produced a first and second generation of young local architects who were engaged in modernity. My father was part of those, and in the 60s, when the great what was his name? Oh, my brain is fried. Oscar Niemeyer came to Beirut. They pointed at him and said that he was a dinosaur. So they really believed that there was a local modernity at the making, and it was coming. It was emerging from within. Unfortunately, the nation-state project has gone bankrupt, and modernity with it went bankrupt. And there's another kind of modernity that started developing further east towards the Gulf states, and it's that crap. It's that crap that produces these stupid symbols. Now, not only is it stupid from above, but when you come close to it, what you see here is in fact this nightmare. Amazing. This was a very pornographic building or no, not pornographic, I would say very erotic building I produced but never built in Saudi Arabia. A woman's only leisure facility called Surra Man Ra'a, pleasure to those who see. A building that had no windows. It was in fact just translucent glass blocks at street level, and 2 elevator operators in their cockpits with their fake wings behind, getting the elevators up the ground so that when the lady arrives and is being dropped because she can't drive, they would go up. The lady goes inside the elevator, and once the elevator door is shut, she can get naked and come down. And once she's below, she can see the shadows of the poor males that are crawling on that surface, trying to see what's below, but they can't see. So those below can see, but those above cannot see. It was a very sort of erotic veil over the building. And I think when the clients understood what this was about, story was over. You have to give them what they don't have. This was suspended topography, Dubai, but didn't make it. The art collector, I'll skip tonight. How am I doing with time? The art collector for whom I had designed the extension of his main fashion outlets. He's built an empire out of fashion retail, and pretty soon, a few years ago, turned into an art collector and is probably the most important art collector in the region now, one of the most important in the world, and wants to build a foundation, which he commissions me to start with. And this was a mistake, obviously, because what I've worked on was exactly the opposite of what he wanted. He wanted the credibility of an institution. He wanted to move out of retail and into the very noble art world. And then what I did is, in fact, exactly the opposite. Worked on this critical relationship between fashion, advertisement, and art. And art is, in fact, culture is, in fact, not where you think it is. So we had produced the largest stretched canvas in the world, which was not an art piece, or was, which was not an ad billboard, or was it? And above that, the longest bar in the world, 170 meters long, only 4 meters wide, overlooking the highway and the sea, and an instrument to engage into the building with a car. He didn't like it, and he went and built it with a guy, a very good-looking guy, tall, slim, dark-skinned, David Adjaye. Produced a very cute building. Another very circumstantial building. This was one of the first temporary buildings I built. This is back in 2004. A building that turns its butt to Syria. 2004 was prior to the Syrian army pulling out. For those of you who don't know our story, or pathetic political story, up until 2005, and I'd say up until now, our politicians would go to Damascus to get their orders. So this is 12 minutes away from the border, and on the way you could see the idiot politicians going to take orders or a few slaps by the Assad regime. But there was something far more interesting happening the other way around, much less visible. A lot of cash coming in plastic bags in cars, because there's a lot of cash in Syria and very poor, if not no private banking, while the banking sector is very developed in Lebanon. So Stura became crowded with a lot of very oversized bank pavilions. This was one of them, the BLC Bank. And when I understood the phenomenon of these banks functioning extremely well because they were sucking Syrian cash, I thought the story was too good to make a generic bank pavilion. What I did is a very sort of closed shell that turns its back to Syria as it sucks in Syrian cash and basically spits it out from an ATM machine facing Beirut. So sometimes very basic elements can have the ATM machine can have their role into your architecture. The gallerist for whom I produced the cemetery of my projects back in 2006, this is my office, and the floor is red to keep my collaborators very nervous so that they don't go to sleep. And in the background, in the very distant background, is a panorama of the distant cityscape in which all the unbuilt projects never made it, and they roam like angels, cadavers. And you can see them in my website. The curator to whom I built back in 2008, I think it was a while ago, a military dispositif, a military machine that would serve to the exchange of prisoners of war. So it strangely resembles the F-117 stealth bomber, but all it is just a carcass for the prisoner to crawl in as he makes it back to his camp, with eyes that are not his, but are the two cameras that are connected back to the camp that just released him, his enemies, and he serves as a drone. And we had proven by using very scientific military terms from the American lexicon, defense lexicon, how in fact this was a very feasible, in fact very pragmatic piece of technology. I'm very obsessed with speed. This is the fastest man, and the regression in the order of speed. So he's seated with his laptop on his laps, and this was the McLaren F1 of the year at the time. That represents a first regression in the order of speed, mechanical speed, and then animal speed, the speed at which we evolved up until the 19th century, and finally detention speed, which is what my installation was about. It is in fact the cover of Local Heroes, the book that we just published about a year ago. This is Delirious, derailing Beirut, not delirious. What a catastrophic faux pas. No, derailing Beirut. And we've mapped in Beirut points of interest that were fetishized in the recent construction of the sort of post-war history of the city. And this is a map that would serve the curious intellectual, the curious tourist, or the tourist intellectual to consume the city extremely quickly. I'm very fascinated by this issue of tourism and the very superficial curiosity that some of those intellectuals may have of our city. So we've plotted these points and we've projected them on the city, literally as a new layer on which that would serve us to link these points. And so you can go in and out of the Holiday Inn hotel in a split second, very, very quickly for extreme pleasure, morbid pleasure. And for that, we've invented the machine in which we could put the tourist in, and we've very carefully placed his head where the detonator is for pleasure. And we built the damn thing, and we carried it around the city. And then my guys got arrested by the secret services of the army. I have a problem with them. This is on the Corniche. And finally, the doctor. The doctor, my story with him goes back, but it's a very important story. And maybe after what you've seen and some of the surgical interventions we've done on the buildings, you'll understand where this story falls into and how this character falls into the story. The doctor happens to be my older brother, a brilliant researcher, reconstructive surgeon, microvascular, whatever, very complicated. But back in 1986, I was a beginning student in architecture, and he was doing this research project at Brown University, which had acquired 10 experimental rats. They were white rats that were stripped of their immunity system. And as a good Lebanese, my brother stole one of these rats and replaced it with a regular rat at the lab, and brought this experimental rat home in a transparent cage, and told me, I'll pay you $50 a day, but you keep your eyes on this rat. This is the number of my beeper. There were no cellular phones at the time. And if you see the rat acting strangely, you call me. We're looking for a donor cadaver because we're going to transplant the rat's legs. We're going to take the rat's leg out, and we're going to transplant a fresh cadaver's toe where the rat's leg is. And the idea is to use the rat as a sort of a blood bank that would irrigate the vessels of the toe, of the freshly deceased toe. But the idea is that on the long run, we could use animals that are stripped of their immunity to irrigate members of accidented bodies until the bodies are in a good shape, or in a good enough shape to take their members back. So imagine you lose your arm and you're not in a stable condition. We take your arm, we stitch it to a pig's leg, and the pig does not reject the arm until you're fine enough. We can remove your arm back from the pig and plant it back where it belongs. The idea was revolutionary. So I spent 3 days looking at this cage, which was transparent, looking at the rat, my brother calling every 2 hours, how's the rat doing? The rat's doing great. And I couldn't sleep. I was paid $50 a day. And they could not find the donor cadaver until at some point 3 days later, they find somewhere in Massachusetts this older lady who was 92 years old, who was giving her body to science. So they go and they amputate one of the toes. They come, they take the rat, and they go do their job, my brother and his partner, and they reconnect the vessels of the toes veins to the vessels of the horrible toe. She had a very, very horrible toe with a very long nail that was pointing down. Very horrible. So the rat comes back in its transparent cage, now with a toe. And I'm asked to look at this toe and the rat non-stop while my brother goes back to the hospital and does his job, which I did. But luckily or unluckily for me, after a few hours, my brother goes into an operation that wouldn't end for like 6-7 hours. And at that point, I had not slept for 3 days looking at the rat. And now the rat with the toe for $50 a day. And at some point, I'm looking at this rat and I'm looking at this toe and I fall asleep. And then my brother gets out of his operating room 6 hours later. The phone rings. I wake up. I get the phone and he's asking me how the rat's doing. I turn around. I look at the rat. I look at the cage and I see the rat stuck at the corner of the cage because it was transparent and the idiot thought he could escape. And he kept on pushing forward and got stuck in the corner. I couldn't push back because the toe was too heavy, and ended up dying, suffocating at the corner of the cage, and the whole operation went, well, bankrupt because of me. Years later, when I decided to move back to Beirut, my brother, who had become at that point a very successful doctor, told me, there's a saying in Arabic that says, you're going to act like a rooster on top of a garbage dump. And I always think of that, particularly when the Johnny Walker campaign celebrated me as their mascot. So not a lot of architects do that. All my intellectual friends were telling me, no, you're pushing it too far. Don't do this. This is too vulgar. So that's me walking. And I was on the 8 o'clock news every day for 30 seconds for a full year, to the point I couldn't stand it anymore. I wouldn't watch TV. But I was everywhere. And this is a 40 meters high poster smack at the exit of the northbound exit of Beirut. If you look closer here, I am much bigger than Paris Hilton, and I'm above her. Not all architects can say that. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Bernard, for your lecture. Yeah. We didn't know you were funny, man. That you were funny also. That's good. All right, so now if you are available for some questions, I would pass. Calma, Abdullah. One second, let me finish. So, if our audience have some questions, this is your opportunity for reach our guest.
The ceiling, the ventilation, the ducts,
Yeah.
made out of plaster.
Someone told you that?
No.
Yes.
No.
The first person to get you're the first person to get the right.
No, I have a
Now
reason
you're not
why.
getting a free ticket.
These are our students, of course. Nothing less
No,
expected.
no one told me, but I'm a smart interior designer.
I don't believe you.
I swear. I don't want your ticket. I just wanted to tell you that.
Of course you want my ticket.
No words.
No one got it. No.
Yeah, but I'm a smart interior designer.
No.
I'm serious.
I am too.
Any less smart question, please? Yeah.
Hi. It's perhaps not an architectural question, but I would be interested to know what sparked your interest in your revolt against the industry.
Which industry?
Well,
The construction industry?
Yeah.
Yeah, not the developers. What? Well.
Or how did you?
I know. It's a
yourself
very good question.
Politically inclined?
It's a very good question. The minute I could hear what was happening behind the door. If you're in a hotel room and you can hear what's happening behind the door in the next door, sometimes you don't want to hear it, sometimes you want to hear it, but sometimes you don't want to hear it. Doors are becoming extremely thin. Aluminum profiles are being cut and installed by morons who know nothing about facades. The building industry, basically, building standards are going down the drain. There's no, and those are killing local artisanries, and you can find local artisanry and great trades anywhere you go in very specific sectors, depending on where you are. But those are disappearing. They're disappearing because we're pushed by the construction industry that imposes so-called standards on us that are of absolutely no interest for me. If anything, they're limiting, and they're limiting our questioning and our manipulation of things, of matter. What I love about this place is exactly the fact that, well, I still consider it very much artisanry, because it's not because you're manipulating very, very sophisticated machines that you're no longer doing your work as an artisan. This is artisanry. This is one form of resisting the standards of the industry that is basically giving you a catalog of parts that you can no longer question, that have become the norm, and that's it. So you no longer have the leeway to rethink the chair, the ashtray, the window profile, the door, things that are very fundamental, and need constant reevaluation. Not in the global, not that I think they should be reevaluated in their global definition, but sometimes very locally and very specifically in every specific project. I think a door in a specific room on a very specific situation cannot be the same door in another specific room in another specific situation. What the standards of the industry do is that they flatten this, and they produce flat standards to be applied from Shanghai to Dubai, to Barcelona, and to Beirut, the same. And I think that is a pity. I think you should reconsider, you should learn and have the ability to reconsider those very basic components of building.
Thank you for this amazing lecture, and thank you, IAAC, for this lecture. This is one of the best lectures I've been in, and one of the best architectural presentations I've seen. I have two questions, and so I had to write it in my phone. The first one: how do the user and the developer in Beirut or somewhere around the world receive your dynamic responsive systems? What is the user experience after the construction and when they experience it in live?
Can you repeat the first question slowly? What is?
The first question is, how do the user receive it, meaning experience it? And the second part of the first question is, how do the developers see this dynamic systems? The second question is, what is your inspiration for this?
Let's go question by question. So, I think my work is very is not elitist at all. I think I'm very keen on that. I don't necessarily communicate with architects or to architects specifically. I think architecture is a practice that has been going bankrupt for quite a while. So I have spent great effort in trying to communicate and love to see my work circulating in other avenues and just purely the territory of architecture. I'll give you an example and an anecdote, which is a true one, which was to me extremely flattering. We completed, just to answer the question of the user and the developer, when we completed one of the buildings I did not show you, but that was also a very unconventional dwelling, urban dwelling by the standards of the industry, in the sense that I had also the building was sculpted by circuits outside on its facade. And what articulated was the facade was how you could move from every single room to another without ever walking inside if you felt like it. And there were split sections. So when they inaugurated this building, a few months after the people had started living in it, maybe about 10 owners of apartments in this building, they organized all together sort of an open house. Basically, they all invited their friends, and they had the houses open to one another so people could walk from one house to the other and get a drink and meet other people. And I arrived there, I was invited, being the architect of the building, and I was very touched by the housewives. The housewives, the very bourgeois housewives, perched on the very high heels and perfectly manicured and super pretty, and not the profile of the you would expect of the architectural critic who reads thick architectural books. And these would take me by the hand into their bedrooms, not what you think, telling me how they wake up and how they move around their facades and how they go and have their coffee and how they meet their kids in the morning. And they had literally read their plan, not experienced their plan even beyond what I had dictated or what I had imagined initially in my scheme. And this was very, very touching to me because I had seen that this had worked with people who had no architectural pretension whatsoever. This was what it was about. It was about your basic housewife, your basic bourgeois housewife, but who could enjoy, at least the intent of the poetic dimension of the architect. And same applies to the developer. He was there. And this is someone who became a recurrent client with whom we've built, I think, 8-9 projects in Beirut, who works exclusively with me. It's interesting to see that developers didn't think that my product would sell. And a few years later, I very proudly say, I know it's not very elegant to say it this way, but every real estate project I've put my hands on in the perimeter of Beirut over the last 7-8 years has sold in pre-sales most of its apartment prior to acquiring building permits, and at prices that are way, 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 way higher than the building next door. So it's not about location, and it's not. And I want to believe that architecture could, even in the terms of the developers, and even in their own territory, and even in their own terms, can prove that their recipes are wrong. But if you work with someone who has the intelligence to re-question those and understand what, at some point in time, on a very specific geographic point, what you could bring forward as an experience, and this could have a value. And I think this is where the architect comes in. And I want to believe that there's still a place for us, even in the private sector.
Actually, you answered my part of the second question. Second question was the inspiration for the design protocol. I think your design protocol comes from the user experience, right?
Yes, I mean, it comes from this obsession of this very specific situation. And I think, as I might have said briefly during the presentation, I very much believe in the local. When I got out of school, and it's important to say it in front of students, we all have this very dumb idea of becoming, we all want to be another international figure. Now, the international figure is very interesting because what international certainties have produced over the last 40 or 50 years has proven to be completely wrong. And I see these international certainties, or these global certainties, come with very major figures on our territory intervene, and I've seen the fuck-ups they've produced. Literally, catastrophic. So I want to believe in the local. I want to believe that that you can only do very, very pertinent work when you own the streets you walk on. Literally like a mafiosi. When you can say one thing to her and one thing to him simultaneously that while contradicting yourself, but without ever being a charlatan, and without ever being cynical. I hate cynical people. With a great dose of belief, of great honesty. But she forced you to say something, and then the situation did, and then he took you somewhere else. And the two realities are very different, one from the other. When you have this complex of the context that we have as architects, because some of us have produced, we've seen very major figures produce very thick books, 500 pages about this or that territory. And after that, they've proven that they've had the curiosity to understand or research. I love the term research and archives. It's been overused and used and used again, abused again and again. Research. They research, so they produce a 500-page book. They go and lock themselves in a grad school and take 12 morons who are going to produce data, more data, generic stuff, and then they're going to put 500 pages book that you won't even wipe your ass with. That is supposed to prove a curiosity to the territory and produce supposedly an understanding and maybe, hopefully, some kind of understanding of context. That context, to me, is a very dangerous simplification of context and history because it produces generic consensual definitions. Data is extremely dangerous, my friend. Don't ever try to trap any city in any kind of consensual definition. I'm completely against that. You become contextual the minute you are liberated from being contextual. You become contextual when you are able to engage in the most intimate way with the situation that made your project possible. That is below the ground, below the consensual definitions, below any sort of theoretical stance one can have over the territory. That is contextual, and that produces meaning. So, I don't know if this answers your question, but context is something you invent, and you have to have the courage to invent it and the honesty to do it.
Beirut forced you to eventualize and conceptualize these dynamic systems, or what do you mean by contextualizing the?
That's the dynamic to me. It's not the engines. It's not the pistons. It's not the. I like to describe my projects as instruments. The end product, what you're looking at, they're instruments, but they're instruments that are a product of a narrative, or product of a certain logic, of the attempt at building a situation. And for this, I will make use of any means, be it technologically advanced, or be extremely archaic in its mechanics. It does not matter. I will collaborate with the devil. I will use anything, legal or illegal, now, to build my instrument so that it serves the situation that I'm trying to construct. And this is, to me, where the dynamic is. All right. Thank you.